Chapter 2 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Davidson. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 2. The Sumter Expedition. We have mentioned that almost simultaneously with Lincoln's inauguration, the rebel government at Montgomery adopted two measures for obtaining possession of Sumter. The first was when they sent the rebel commissioners to Washington, February 27th, to negotiate for the fort. The second, when, March 3rd, they sent Beauregard to Charleston to complete the batteries and take it by bombardment. While pursuing the former of these measures, they had not for an instant neglected or intermitted the latter. Since February the 6th, therefore, actual war had existed at Charleston. Anderson from the fort and the United States government from without had the undoubted right and rested under the constitutional duty to demolish the menacing works, to revenge the firing on the flag, and to vindicate its obstructed authority. That it did not do this resulted partly from the weakness of the garrison, but more from political considerations. All the while the rebellion pursued the offensive as far as military advantage would justify, the governor of South Carolina proposed, February 13th, to assault the fort, and repeated his suggestion February the 27th. To this, Jefferson Davis replied through his Secretary of War, March 1st, that thorough preparations must first be made. It was to make such preparation that Beauregard was sent to Charleston and urged to his utmost diligence. "Give but little credit to the rumors of an amicable adjustment," wrote the rebel secretary. "Do not slacken for a moment your energies, and be ready to execute any order this department may forward." While Beauregard was thus from without environing Sumter with formidable preparations for attack, with a host of negro laborers and practically unlimited materials, Foster, the engineer officer of the fort, was, within its walls, busy in devising and constructing preparations for defense. He had retained some 30 or 40 workmen, and though his materials were limited, he made the best use of those at hand. Had the resources been more equal, this might have lived in military records as one of the most exciting contests of engineering skill, and science and ingenuity might have changed a chapter of history. From the time of the occupation of Sumter, Anderson and his garrison were really in a state of siege, and under an irksome espionage and duress in their communication with the outer world. Nevertheless, they yet received their mails, and were allowed to make certain purchases of fresh provisions in the Charleston market. There was a running fire of correspondence, interviews, protests, and explanations between the opposing parties, calculated to produce friction and irritation. But on the whole, the temper on both sides was held well in check, and a commendable practice of external courtesies observed almost to the last. But this show of civility was entirely subordinated to the military question. Anderson's mere personal sympathies were probably with the Southern people, but never with the Southern rebellion. His soldierly loyalty to his flag and government was as steady and as bright as a vestal flame. In some discussion he had said that if attacked and I found that I could not hold possession of the fort, I would blow it up, sacrificing our lives in preference to permitting ourselves to fall into their hands. Whether this language, or the fact that Foster had already planted some mines at the landing wharf at Sumter to repel an assault, had come to the knowledge of the rebel authorities, they began to grow apprehensive that their coveted prize might not pass intact into their hands. "Dispatches just received from Washington," wrote Walker to Beauregard, of the highest authority, speak of mines in Fort Sumter, and a purpose to destroy it and the garrison rather than be taken. Foster, the engineer, might be a good guarantee if kept in the fort." A few days later the idea was amplified by official instructions. In case the fort were abandoned, Beauregard was informed that he must not give Anderson safe conduct unless perfectly assured that there are no mines laid with trains within the fort. And if he declined to give such assurances, Beauregard was to keep him where he is. This was while rumors of evacuation were coming thick and fast from Washington. The visits of Fox and Lamon to Anderson strengthened these impressions at Charleston, and immediately thereafter Beauregard undertook to bring this point to Anderson's notice. Assuming that Lamon had communicated to Governor Pickens an intimation that the garrison would be withdrawn, Beauregard wrote to say that no formal surrender would be required, but that whenever you will be prepared to leave the fort, if you will inform Governor Pickens or myself of your intentions relative thereto, we will be happy to see that you are provided with proper means of transportation out of this harbor for yourself and command, including baggage, private and company property. All that will be required of you on account of the public rumors that have reached us will be your word of honor as an officer and a gentleman that the fort, all public property therein, its armament, etc., shall remain in their present condition, without any arrangements or preparation for their destruction or injury after you shall have left the fort. Anderson flared up under the humiliating proposal. "I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your letter of this date," he replied, "and hasten to say that I needed no denial from you of the expression attributed to you. The moment I heard that you had said that I should not leave this fort without surrendering, I remarked that it was not true, and that I knew you had not said so. I am much obliged to His Excellency the Governor and yourself for the assurances you give me, but you must pardon me for saying that I feel deeply hurt at the intimation in your letter about the conditions that shall be exacted of me, and I must state most distinctly that if I can only be permitted to leave on the pledge you mention, I shall never, so help me God, leave this fort alive." Beauregard saw that he had blundered, and at once returned an apologetic note, saying that he had only mentioned the rumors on account of their high source, and expressing regrets at having referred to the subject. Anderson gracefully acknowledged the amende, adding, "I only regret that rumors from any source made you for one moment have the slightest doubt as to the straight path of honor and duty in which I trust by the blessing of God ever to be found." Beauregard made the best of his failure by reporting to Montgomery that Anderson had refused to give the required pledge, but that he considered his answer equivalent to one, where the matter was also dropped. Although thus manfully maintaining his attitude of loyalty and duty, it was clear that Anderson finally fell into the belief and hope that he and his command would be withdrawn, and the feeling came near leading him into a serious error, aided by an accidental inadvertence of a subordinate, and more especially by the fact that the government had not as yet sent him any definite instructions for his temporary guidance. This was probably a mere oversight. Lincoln supposed he had provided for the case in his order to General Scott of March 9, to hold all military places. It does not appear that General Scott repeated this order to post commanders, and hence Anderson's latest instructions were those from Holt, dated February the 23rd, in which a former declaration was repeated that "the attitude of that garrison, as has often been declared, is neither menacing nor defiant, nor unfriendly. It is acting under orders to act strictly on the defensive." Anderson had means of knowing that this direction signified the abandonment of the Ward expedition. Since that time, therefore, he and his officers had apparently given up the hope that Sumter was to be permanently held, though they wished to retire with honor. It was upon this idea that they furnished the new administration their very extravagant estimates for relief. Foster's letters expressed pleasure at the reported labors of the Peace Convention, and asked instructions based upon the assumption of a withdrawal of the forces. When Fox visited the fort, Anderson, as we have seen, manifested very decided disapproval at the plan of succor, which that officer did not communicate, but in Anderson's words, merely hinted at. Lamon's visit a few days later was more welcome, for though he brought neither positive instruction nor information, he inquired about the condition of the garrison and the best and most feasible methods of removal, and whether the rebels would permit them to depart if that painful measure should be found unavoidable. But nothing was promised, nothing concluded. If Lamon was authorized to arrange matters, Anderson ought now to say so, wrote the governor to Beauregard. It will be seen by Major Anderson's answer, if there be any truth in the man, that nothing like a doubtful course can be feared from him on the evacuation of Fort Sumter, which ought now to be decided upon in a few days, wrote Beauregard to the rebel secretary. Anderson naturally fell into the current belief, but day by day passed, and still the orders did not come. Meantime, events were hastening to a crisis. Foster's 40-odd workmen were both a help and an encumbrance. While they built defenses, they also consumed supplies, and could now no longer be kept. "As our provisions are very nearly exhausted," wrote Anderson at the end of March, "I have requested Captain Foster to discharge his laborers, retaining only enough for a boat's crew. I hope to get them off tomorrow. The last barrel of flour was issued day before yesterday. The South Carolina Secretary of War has not sent the authority asked for yesterday to enable me to send off the discharged laborers. Having been in daily expectation, since the return of Colonel Lamon to Washington, of receiving orders to vacate this post, I have kept these men here as long as I could. I told Mr. Fox that if I placed the command on short allowance, I could make the provisions last until after the 10th of this month, but as I have received no instructions from the department that it was desirable I should do so, it has not been done. If the governor permits me to send off the laborers, we will have rations enough to last us about 1 week longer." 2 days after this letter was written, another exciting incident occurred in Charleston harbor. A schooner from Boston with a cargo of ice for Savannah, having lost her reckoning in the fog, and supposing she had reached her destination, by mistake undertook to come into the harbor without a pilot. When abreast the Morris Island battery, shots were fired by the rebels across her bows, whereupon her captain ran up the United States flag. This started a cannonade from all the batteries in reach, and the master, now divining that he was in hostile quarters, hauled down his flag, put his ship about, and, running without serious damage out of gunshot, came to anchor. Anderson once more felt his indignation rising, and prepared to open the guns of Sumter in reply, but, as in the case of the Star of the West, the firing ceased before he was ready. Reporting the circumstances to Washington, and referring to the old orders which put him in a defensive attitude, he said, "I deeply regret that I did not feel myself at liberty to resent the insults thus offered to the flag of my beloved country." And in a later communication, "The truth is that the sooner we are out of this harbor the better. Our flag runs an hourly risk of being insulted, and my hands are tied by my orders, and if that were not the case, I have not the power to protect it. God grant that neither I nor any other officer of our army may be again placed in a position of such mortification and humiliation." He started an inquiry into the affair, which brought him a practical apology from the rebel authorities for this incident, but it also brought him an unwelcome and harsh piece of misinformation. Lieutenant G.W. Snyder, whom he had sent to Charleston on this errand, made him a written report that the governor said that orders had been received from Montgomery not to allow any man in the ranks or any laborers to leave Fort Sumter, and not to allow Major Anderson to obtain supplies in Charleston. That Mr. Crawford, a commissioner from the Confederate States, now in Washington, had sent a dispatch to him, stating that he was authorized to say that no attempt would be made to reinforce Fort Sumter with men or provisions, but that Mr. Lincoln would not order Major Anderson to withdraw from Fort Sumter, and would leave him to act for himself. This rendering of Crawford's dispatch was a material variance from the original, dated April 1st, which ran as follows: I am authorized to say that this government will not undertake to supply Sumter without notice to you, Governor Pickens. My opinion is that the President has not the courage to execute the order agreed upon in Cabinet for the evacuation of the fort, but that he intends to shift the responsibility upon Major Anderson by suffering him to be starved out. By whose design or act the perversion of language occurred cannot now be determined, but Anderson's comment seems based on the error. I have the honor to report everything still and quiet, and to send herewith the report of Lieutenant Snyder, whom I sent yesterday with a short note and verbal message to the Governor of South Carolina. No reply has been received to my note. I cannot but think that Mr. Crawford has misunderstood what he has heard in Washington, as I cannot think that the government would abandon, without instructions or without advice, a command which has tried to do all its duty to our country. I cannot think that if the government decides to do nothing which can be construed into a recognition of the fact of the dissolution of the Union, that it will, at all events, say to me that I must do the best I can, and not compel me to do an act which will leave my motives and actions liable to misconception. I am sure that I shall not be left without instructions, even though they may be confidential. After 30-odd years of service, I do not wish it to be said that I have treasonably abandoned a post and turned over to unauthorized persons public property entrusted to my charge. I am entitled to this act of justice at the hands of my government, and I feel confident that I shall not be disappointed. What to do with the public property and where to take my command are questions to which answers will, I hope, be at once returned. Unless we receive supplies, I shall be compelled to stay here without food, or to abandon this post very early next week. Commissioner Crawford's opinion was simply an untruthful guess. 2 days before its transmission, as we have already seen, President Lincoln, who never harbored the remotest thought of sacrificing Anderson, had ordered the Fox expedition to be prepared to succor him, and on the day before Anderson wrote his letter, was with his own hand drafting the precise instructions so earnestly solicited. The following is the entire order, copied from the original. Washington, April 4th, 1861. Sir, your letter of the 1st instant occasioned some anxiety to the President. On the information of Captain Fox, he had supposed you could hold out until the 15th instant, without any great inconvenience, and had prepared an expedition to relieve you before that period. Hoping still that you will be able to sustain yourself until the 11th or 12th instant, the expedition will go forward, and, finding your flag flying, will attempt to provision you, and in case the effort is resisted, will endeavor also to reinforce you. You will, therefore, hold out, if possible, till the arrival of the expedition. It is not, however, the intention of the President to subject your command to any danger or hardship beyond what, in your judgment, would be usual in military life, and he has entire confidence that you will act as becomes a patriot and a soldier under all circumstances. Whenever, if at all, in your judgment, to save yourself and command, a capitulation becomes necessary, you are authorized to make it. This manuscript draft, in its tone so considerate and humane, in its foresight and moderation so eminently characteristic of its author, was sent to the War Department, where it was copied in quadruplicate, addressed to Major Robert Anderson, signed by Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, and one copy immediately transmitted by mail to Fort Sumter, while other copies were dispatched by other methods. That same afternoon the Secretary of War and General Scott gave to Captain Fox, who, having completed his preliminary arrangements, had come to Washington for the purpose, his final and confidential orders for the command, the destination, the supplies, and the reinforcements of the expedition. In a conversation that afternoon, Fox reminded Lincoln that but 9 days would remain in which to reach Charleston from New York, a distance of 637 miles, and that with this diminished time his chances were greatly reduced. But the President, who had calculated all the probabilities of failure, and who, with more comprehensive statesmanship, was looking through and beyond the Sumter expedition to the now inevitable rebel attack and the response of an awakened and united North, calmly assured him that he should best fulfill his duty by making the attempt. Captain Fox returned to New York April 5th, also bearing with him the orders of the Secretary of the Navy for the necessary cooperation of the war vessels. On the evening of April 8, the merchant steamer Baltic, bearing 200 recruits, the required supplies, and Captain Fox dropped down the bay and went to sea early next morning, with the belief and understanding that the warships Powhatan, Pawnee, Pocahontas, and Harriet Lane, and the steam tugs Uncle Ben, Yankee, and Freeborn would meet the Baltic at the appointed rendezvous, 10 miles off Charleston Bar, due east of the lighthouse, on the morning of April the 11th, to provision Fort Sumter if permitted, or if resisted, to attempt its reinforcement. Commissioner Crawford, when he sent his dispatch of April 1st, expressing the opinion that Anderson would be suffered to be starved out, had added the insidious suggestion, quote, "Would it not be well to aid in this by cutting off all supplies?" Beauregard, who first received the dispatch, in his turn telegraphed it to the rebel secretary at Montgomery with the laconic addition, "Batteries here ready to open Wednesdays or Thursday. What instructions?" The instructions came back promptly, under date of April 2nd. Beauregard was told that he must keep himself in the state of amplest preparation, that the withdrawal of the commissioners from Washington might occur at any moment, that Anderson's supplies must be absolutely stopped, and that, "in general terms, the status which you must at once reestablish and rigidly enforce is that of hostile forces in the presence of each other, and who may at any moment be in actual conflict." Beauregard, acknowledging this order, asked further instructions concerning Anderson's mails. They had been allowed to go daily. Should they be continued or limited to once or twice a week? The reply shows how tenaciously the rebels clung to the idea of peaceable secession, and that the fort would finally be given up. "Acting, then, on the leading ideas that the military isolation of Fort Sumter and the prevention of all possible espionage by the Washington government are absolutely required, you are directed, while allowing Major Anderson to receive his mails, to exercise such instructive discretion as will secure the ends in view. Minute instructions covering every possible case cannot, of course, be given you, but you are directed to exclude possibility of the admission of anyone who may be sent by or be favorable to the government at Washington, always excepting such messenger or bearer of dispatches from that government as you may be fully assured shall be conveying orders for the surrender or evacuation of the fortress." Next day, April 7th, Beauregard gave Anderson notice that in compliance with orders no further communication with Charleston for purposes of supply would be permitted, and that the mails, however, will continue to be transmitted as heretofore until further instructions. But he said not one word about the instructive discretion, which we will see was soon exercised, at least with his help and sanction, in violation of this broad and unqualified statement to a former brother officer, whom he was still on the same day addressing as "Dear Major," and assuring that "nothing shall be wanting on my part to preserve the friendly relations and impressions which have existed between us so many years." The increased espionage upon Anderson was not without its special motive. The rebel authorities were gradually realizing that Commissioner Crawford's prediction was a delusion. Their hopes of a delivery of Sumter and a peaceable adjustment were fading out. Since that prediction was made, warning telegrams and letters, some of which were quoted in a previous chapter, had been coming with ominous persistence from various quarters. Two of these attracted their serious attention. One was from a regular correspondent at Washington, who mentioned the various rumors with evident prudence and good judgment, and summed up a decided preponderance of indications of a war policy. "A Virginia submissionist," wrote he, "came up here the other day to get some pacific assurances from Lincoln and Seward. He told a gentleman afterwards that their answers were vague and unsatisfactory. I am satisfied that Lincoln's own feelings and theories of duty all run on the side of coercion. It appears to me the administration is concentrating its resources for a blow. In writing to you before I put the case less strongly than my convictions, because others here with opportunities to form a judgment thought differently, but every development, everything that can be construed into a development of official intentions, confirms what I wrote." This was from an active secessionist. The other was an anonymous dispatch in these words: "Positively determined not to withdraw Anderson. Supplies go immediately, supported by naval force under Stringham. If their landing is resisted, a friend." Judge Magrath of Charleston, to whom it was first sent, immediately transmitted it to Montgomery with the comment, "Governor and General Beauregard visiting the post in the harbor and will not be here for a few hours. In their absence, I telegraphed to Washington to know who was the person signing himself 'a friend.' The reply satisfies me that the person is high in the confidence of the government at Washington." Whether the rebel authorities actually learned the name of the informant at the time is doubtful. It turns out to be James E. Harvey, shortly before appointed minister to Portugal. The only practical result of Harvey's anonymous telegram was to increase the espionage over Anderson. Jefferson Davis dreaded the trial of war, and had faith in the success of intrigue. On the very day, and evidently after the Harvey dispatch came to hand, he wrote, "With equal confidence in our power to meet the political danger of peace and the physical danger of war, I await the determination of a problem which belongs to the government of the United States to control." We have seen that for more than a week the problem had been determined in the mind of President Lincoln. He saw not only the breadth and depth of the mighty struggle impending, but the true relation and effect of the intellectual and moral influences and physical forces to be drawn into contention. Abstractly, it was enough that the government was in the right, but to make the issue sure, he determined that in addition the rebellion should be put in the wrong. Liberty should have not only the judgment, but the sympathy of mankind. In his own language, having said to them in the inaugural address, "You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors," he took pains not only to keep this declaration good, but also to keep the case so free from the power of ingenuous sophistry that the world should not be able to misunderstand it. Towards the latter end of March, while the interviews and conversations were going on between Justice Campbell and Seward, and the Sumter affairs were a daily topic of discussion, Lincoln, to use his own words, told Mr. Seward that he might say to Justice Campbell that I should not attempt to provision the fort without giving them notice. That was after I had duly weighed the matter and came to the deliberate conclusion that it would be the best policy. If there was nothing before to bind us in honor to give such notice, I felt so bound after this word was out. It is impossible to fix the exact date of this presidential instruction, but several allusions indicate it with sufficient nearness. A dispatch of the commissioners, under date of March 22nd, uses the phrase, "And what is of infinite importance to us, that notice will be given him (Campbell) of any change in the existing status." So also Mr. Welles, advising the Fox expedition in the Cabinet meeting of March 29, adds, "and of communicating at the proper time the intentions of the government to provision the fort peaceably if unmolested." Finally, as already stated, Mr. Seward on April 1st gave Campbell the written memorandum. The President may desire to supply Sumter, but will not do so without giving notice to Governor Pickens." Now that the Fox expedition was ready and ordered to sail, President Lincoln proceeded to carry out this part of his plan. Again, with his own hand, he prepared the following instruction: Washington, April 6, 1861. Sir: You will proceed directly to Charleston, South Carolina, and if, on your arrival there, the flag of the United States shall be flying over Fort Sumter, and the fort shall not have been attacked, you will procure an interview with Governor Pickens, and read to him as follows: I am directed by the President of the United States to notify you to expect an attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only, and that if such an attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice, or in the case of an attack upon the fort. After you shall have read this to Governor Pickens, deliver to him the copy of it, here enclosed, and retain this letter yourself. But if, on your arrival at Charleston, you shall ascertain that Fort Sumter shall have already been evacuated or surrendered by the United States force, or shall have been attacked by opposing forces, you will seek no interview with Governor Pickens, but return here forthwith. This autographed manuscript draft of Lincoln's was also copied and signed Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, and placed in the hands of R.S. Chew, a faithful clerk of the State Department, who, thus clothed with military character and authority, proceeded at once to Charleston. His own brief report states the result: Under the foregoing order, I left Washington at 6 p.m. Saturday, April 6, 1861, in the company with Captain Theodore Talbot, U.S. Army, and arrived at Charleston, South Carolina, on Monday of the same hour. Finding that Fort Sumter had neither been surrendered, evacuated, nor attacked, I immediately, through Captain Talbot, requested an interview with Governor Pickens, which was at once accorded me, and I then read to him the portion of said orders in italics, and delivered to him the copy of the same, which was furnished to me for that purpose, in the presence of Captain Talbot. Governor Pickens received the copy, and said he would submit it to General Beauregard, he having, since the ratification of the Constitution of the Confederate States by South Carolina, been placed in charge of the military operations in this vicinity. General Beauregard was accordingly sent for, and the governor read the paper to him. In reply to a remark made by Governor Pickens in reference to an answer, I informed him that I was not authorized to receive any communication from him in reply. It is necessary to note briefly in this connection the action of the rebel commissioners at Washington. It has been mentioned that on April 1st they communicated to Montgomery very sanguine hopes of a peaceful adjustment. This happy dream they indulged yet some days later, notwithstanding the earlier signs of preparation for the Meigs and the Fox expedition, which they noted and transmitted. Justice Campbell had implicit confidence in the success of his own intrigue, and the commissioners blindly built their faith upon his. "Our intermediary says they dare not deceive him," they wrote, "and as they know, we do not rely upon them, but upon him." The truth was that instead of being deceived by Seward, Campbell was deceiving himself and the commissioners. Day by day, however, their faith crumbled away. The fitting out and sailing of transports and vessels of war from New York and elsewhere became more convincing than Campbell's assurances. Finally, unable longer to endure the suspense, they again appealed to their intermediary. On the morning of Sunday, April 7th, Campbell wrote another note to Seward, saying that the commissioners were alarmed by the reported conversations of the President, by the military movements and the sailing of the Atlantic. He recounted the assurances given, and added, "But if I have said more than I am authorized, I pray you will advise me." In reply, Seward sent the laconic answer which has so often been quoted: "Faith as to Sumter fully kept. Wait and see." In public controversy, Campbell long insisted that this answer meant the evacuation of Sumter, and not the notice to the governor. His own interpretation, however, made in writing at the time, refutes his later assumption. That same afternoon at 2 o'clock, he wrote as follows to the commissioners: I believe that my assurances to you that the government will not undertake to supply Sumter without notice to Governor Pickens will be fully sustained by the event. In reference to Fort Pickens, I have no assurance to make. Heretofore I have felt justified in saying that whenever any measures changing the existing status prejudicially to the Confederate States is contemplated, as respect Fort Pickens, I shall have notice. I do not feel at liberty to say this now. At this point, Justice Campbell's intrigue breaks completely down, and the commissioners resume the task of negotiation. Events since our last, they wrote to Montgomery, have in our judgment made it our duty to require an answer to our official note of March 12th. If Seward's reply is not satisfactory, we shall consider the gauntlet of war thrown down and close our mission. Their secretary called that night at 9 o'clock at Seward's residence to ask for such answer to be delivered the next day at 2 o'clock, though they knew that Seward's unofficial memorandum refusing all recognition or reception or negotiation had been on the files of the State Department since March 15th, waiting their readiness to receive it. It was duly placed in their hands the next afternoon, Monday, April 8th, whereupon the commissioners telegraphed to Montgomery, "This government politely declines in a written paper to recognize our official character or the power we represent. We shall rejoin and then leave the city unless otherwise ordered." Late that night a telegram from Beauregard informed them for the first time that a relief expedition was on its way to Sumter, and that the President had sent Governor Pickens notice of its coming. Thus, on the evening of April 8, 1861, the Montgomery authorities received decisive information from both Washington and Charleston that all their hopes of recognition or peaceful disunion were at an end, and that the desperate trial of war was at length upon them. Already to some extent forewarned of this contingency, they hastened to make all possible dispositions to meet it. The 7 states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas were now united in the rebel government. They were promptly notified of the changed conditions of affairs, and each asked to raise a contingent of 3,000 volunteers. Bragg at Pensacola was notified that "our commissioners at Washington have received a flat refusal," and was instructed to put himself on the defensive, while officers, supplies, and soldiers were ordered to his support with earnestness and energy. Beauregard was once more put on the alert, and ordered to increase his vigilance and rigor. "Under no circumstances are you to allow provisions to be sent to Fort Sumter. Major Anderson's mails must be stopped. The fort must be completely isolated." Beauregard complied with alacrity, issued orders, and sent detachments to his posts, and batteries armed additional guard boats to patrol the harbor, and called out the entire remainder of the contingent of 5,000 men which had been authorized. Governor Pickens now committed another piece of sharp practice. Beauregard's promise to Anderson was that the mails would be transmitted until further instructions. Walker's instruction was Anderson's mails must be stopped. Instead of this, General Beauregard, apparently ashamed to do so himself, permitted Governor Pickens to seize and open Anderson's mail under cover of a disingenuous plea. He wrote a notification of stoppage at 8 o'clock on the evening of April 8th, but did not deliver it to Anderson until 2:15 p.m. of the next day, the 9th. Anderson immediately asked the return of mails forwarded prior to the receipt of the notification, but Beauregard answered evasively, saying, "The private letters you refer to in the mail of yesterday were sent to their destination, but the public ones were sent to the Confederate government at Montgomery in return for the treachery of Mr. Fox, who has been reported to have violated his word given to Governor Pickens before visiting Fort Sumter." The allegation was not true. The governor's own letter shows that he seized the mail before the notification was delivered to Anderson, and that the reports urged in justification were found only in letters which the governor had opened. "I took possession of the mails this morning from Sumter and retained the packages marked official." These are all sent to you. The private letters are all sent as directed to their owners. I did this because I consider a state of war is now inaugurated by the authorities at Washington, and all information of a public nature was necessary to us. The incident of the violated mail is mentioned here rather for the purpose of showing that by such means the rebels became possessed of further information about the Fox expedition, since among the letters captured and opened by the governor was Anderson's reply to President Lincoln's instruction of April the 4th, which, as already mentioned, had been copied and signed by Cameron and had reached Anderson by mail. This answer from Anderson becomes doubly interesting, as it shows us the painful struggle caused by the delusion which the distorted report of the Crawford telegram had put him under. Had he been aware that indirectly he was replying to President Lincoln himself, he might have used other language. The material portion ran as follows. I had the honor to receive by yesterday's mail the letter of the Honorable Secretary of War dated April 4th, and confess that what he there states surprises me very greatly, following as it does and contradicting so positively the assurance Mr. Crawford telegraphed he was authorized to make. I trust that this matter will now be at once put in a correct light, as a movement made now, when the South has been erroneously informed that none of such will be attempted, will produce the most disastrous results throughout our country. It is, of course, now too late for me to give any advice in reference to the proposed scheme of Captain Fox. I fear that its result cannot fail to be disastrous for all concerned. Even with his boat at our walls, the loss of life, as I think I mentioned to Mr. Fox, in unloading her, will more than pay for the good to be accomplished by the expedition, which keeps us, if I can maintain possession of this work, out of position, surrounded by strong works, which must be carried to make this fort of the least value to the United States government. We have not oil enough to keep a light in the lantern for one night. The boats will have, therefore, to rely at night entirely upon other marks. I ought to have been informed that this expedition was to come. Colonel Lammon's remark convinced me that the idea, merely hinted at to me by Captain Fox, would not be carried out. We shall strive to do our duty, though I frankly say that my heart is not in the war, which I see is to be thus commenced. That God will still avert it and cause us to resort to pacific measures to maintain our rights is my ardent prayer. The concluding phrases of this letter have been severely criticized, without adequate reason. Read in the light of the long neglect which Anderson had suffered at the hands of President Buchanan, and in his ignorance of President Lincoln's order of March 9, which General Scott had omitted to repeat to post commanders, he felt indeed as if he were forsaken by his government. The condition in which he found himself seemed to place the entire responsibility of peace or war upon his own acts, and rendered him morbidly anxious to avoid any imputation of offense. We can now easily conceive that any sensitive officer laboring under the same error of information would have felt as he did, that the circumstances justified the language of his protest. However much they may have deplored the necessity, Anderson and his garrison made ready to do their duty. As a final effort, Foster directed his engineering skill and employed his imprisoned workmen in constructing a hasty protection for the expected boat or boats, and in preparing ladders and runways to take in reinforcements and provisions at the embouchures rapidly, one embouchure being enlarged so as to admit barrels, and also cleared the passage around the main gate. A large stone traverse was also commenced to cover the main gates from the fire from the Cummings Point. The masons were put at work cutting openings through the walls of the officers' quarters so as to admit a free communication through them. For greater security, the whole garrison took up quarters in the casemates. The only 6 needles in the fort were employed night and day in making up a store of cartridge bags from extra clothing and surplus blankets. Water pipes and faucets were put in order against fire, and ammunition distributed, labors during which their last bread was consumed. Since the place and the time of the conflict could now be determined within very narrow limits, the rebels were also active in their preparations. Rumor had somewhat magnified the proportions of the coming armament, and every nerve was strained in counter efforts. In his letter to Montgomery, Governor Pickens predicted a bloody fight. "We now have," he wrote, 3,700 men at the different posts and batteries, and will have by tomorrow 3,000 more, which I have called down. From my calculation, I think they will have about 2,600, and will attempt to land in launch boats with 24 and 12-pounders, and it will probably be on the lower end of Morris Island, next to the lighthouse. If so, we will have a fine rifle regiment to give them a cordial welcome from behind sand hills that are natural fortifications, and 2 Dahlgren guns will be right on them, besides 24-pounders in the battery. I have 400 fine Enfield rifles that have been practiced at 900 yards, and on that island altogether we have now 1,950 men, and are increasing it today. We expect the attack at about 6 o'clock in the morning on account of the tide." Captain H.J. Hartston, however, with his practical sailor's knowledge and cooler professional judgment, made a different forecast of the nature and chances of the expected attempt. After a night of actual duty in command of the harbor garrison, he was not so sanguine in his predictions. "It is my opinion that Sumter can be relieved," he wrote to Beauregard, "by boats from vessels outside of the bars, on any night as dark as the last. Or if we have to take it, you had better be making a beginning. If a vessel of war is placed off each bar when Sumter opens, I will lose all my steamers, as there will be no escape for me. Therefore, before firing, these steamers should be called in." Beauregard did not neglect his subordinate's warning. He dealt out fresh encouragement to his officers, told them the word impossible must be ignored, made arrangements to illuminate the scene of action with floating lightwood fires and Drummond lights, and gave special directions to concentrate the fire of his batteries on the landing place at Sumter. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Kevin Davidson. www.blogordie.com